Week 27. Last week, I set up the GitHub Public Issues Tracker repo for our lovely testers. That's the main communication hub for folks who have so graciously volunteered their time to help make Shokken better. It's where you'll find issues, bug reports, discussions, and so on and so forth. And going forward, I do intend to use the issues on the public repo primarily and make references to the private PRs and commits in the actual private closed source repo, so that folks can keep an eye on the development progress if they want to. So that's done. Another thing that I ran into last week was mildly infuriating. It relates to Windows, and specifically Windows 11. So up until very recently, I've been using Linux, specifically Fedora 42, the latest and the greatest. However, I purchased a PC component recently, and the driver situation on Linux for that particular cutting-edge PC component is, to say that at the very least, less than desirable. So I had really no choice but to switch to Windows. I had a lot of heartburn with regards to Windows' invasive privacy behavior and a lot of telemetry and just a lot of junk and gunk bloat in an operating system. But I discovered that you can bypass a lot of that just by simply using a very stripped down version of Windows. It's called the Windows 11 IoT LTSC, the Internet of Things long-term support channel. It's great. It really doesn't have any crap and any of the Windows components that you actually need. You can just install afterwards. So that's working well. I've actually been enjoying Windows. I know, unbelievable. Until I started trying to get Claude code to work with Android Studio. So if you install Android Studio on Windows, the build tools as well as the emulator, they sit directly on top of Windows, which makes sense. They're, native code that sits on top of Windows 11. However, Claude code doesn't work natively on Windows, which is fine because Windows provides a facility for that. Windows has something called Windows Subsystem for Linux, WSL. It's essentially a virtual machine running on top of Windows that runs Ubuntu or really any other flavor of Linux that you want to install, which is great. I turned that on and I installed Claude on WSL. And the files in your Windows file system can actually easily be mapped to mount directories within Linux. So Claude on WSL can access files in in Windows, which is where my repository files are, and they can work together. That's great. All is well until you start trying to build, excuse my language, my grammar. When you try to build, keep in mind that Windows uses the tool chain that sits on top of Windows 11. Tools such as Claude code within Linux, they don't have access to the tool chain. They can't directly call that part of the security. Like virtual machines, you're not supposed to call super, right? So what do? Oh, you might think it's easy. You just install a separate tool chain in WSL, which you sure could because it's a virtual machine. Why not, right? So you install the correct version of Java and Android build tools and Gradle and stuff like that. Okay, in WSL. And then you want your Claude code to build inside WSL, and the build fails. Why? Because your builder, the Gradle within Android Studio, within the Android build tools, they look for a file called Local.properties, which is a file that's not committed into version control. It's specific to your local setup. And that file sits at the root directory of your Android project. So every Android project has that, right? And one of the most important functions it does is it points to where the build tools are, points to the Android home. As you can imagine, I have this project in Windows, so it points to the Windows build tools. So as a result, in WSL, it cannot build. And you might think to yourself, well, why don't you set up a environment variable in WSL so that the Gradle build tools know to use the correct build tools? I thought of that. The problem is if local.properties is present in WSL, local.properties supersedes the environment variables that you set. So you have to delete local properties for your environment variables to even work. Now, then, why don't you delete the local.properties? If you deleted local.properties, then it doesn't work in Windows. Windows relies on local.properties within an Android build environment. I know that there's some guides online that say that, okay, you can set up an environment variable under Windows to point to Android Home as well as Java Home. I tried that. I tried so many things. I tried to ask 3 different AI assistants to help me with this issue. It didn't work. For better or for worse, this Windows version that I have, you have to use local.properties for the Android build tools to work correctly on Android that sits on top of Windows. So ultimately, what I had to do is I had to insert a specific snippet within the build script to detect the current environment that it's building and then determine whether or not to ignore local.properties. Very annoying. Like, why is this not the default behavior? I mean, I know I'm probably barking up the wrong tree, right? It's really not Windows 11's fault. It's just the unfortunate situation that takes place when you try to work on this with Claude code in WSL on Windows 11 while developing Android apps. But that's what I ran into. It took me a lot of time, a lot of unkind words towards the screen. But anyways, that's solved. So next week, the goal is to actually start looking into the tickets and the bug reports and the issues that folks come up with and perhaps start working through them. And we'll see how far that takes us. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week.